Okay, now I was doing a webcast and somebody requested my voice be lowered, so doing it a little bit, hopefully a little bit lower now. I did have to delete the webcast that I did before because there was voice intervening and we don't want any such voices or anything right now, distracting right now. But what I was saying before, and I'll repeat what I was saying because the other one was deleted. It was a webcast by a guy who calls himself MrRepzion. In which he makes an assertion that is particularly factually inaccurate so much. Actually, he makes this assertion more than once, sufficiently that I have to refute it. I cannot ignore this assertion. It has to go refuted. It cannot go unrefuted. The assertion is that the Old Testament cannot exist without the New Testament. Well, what is the problem with this assertion? Well, it's factually inaccurate. The Old Testament was in existence long before, and was complete long before the New Testament. The last Old Testament book was written 400 years before any of the events of the New Testament ever occurred. That's why there was the so-called 400 years, silent 400 years. So you have an entire stretch of time spanning from Genesis through Malachi, in which the events of the Old Testament, the writings and so forth, are in place that before there ever was a New Testament. So, agree or disagree with whatever points you may have, or statements you may have, I have other disagreements with him on other things, but I have to correct a fallacy here. The fallacy is that he is claiming that in fact the Old Testament cannot exist without the New Testament. It is complete, absolute fallacy. It is not true. If that were true, what about the 400 years in which it existed before there ever was a New Testament? Before the first book of any of the New Testament was ever written. There have been some arguments about which of the New Testament books was the first. Generally, people believe that it was the epistles of Paul that were written before anything else. Which one was first? There's some debate. But there's also the Gospels, which were written sometime after the epistles of Paul. And of course, there's the epistles of some of the other apostles and so forth. But historically and factually speaking, this is not true. That the notion that the Old Testament could not exist without the New. It's simply not true. It existed for more than 400 years, at least 400 years, in its intact form as the Tanakh. There are copies of it written as the Tanakh, translated directly from the Hebrew. You can find them. They're written by groups like the Jewish Publication Society. These are copies of what in Christianity is called the Old Testament, and in Judaism is called the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. This is fact. This is documented. These books are in publication. So this, is completely false, what he's asserting here. I could respond to several other false assertions of his, but this one I definitely had to refute. This one is overtly false, So I don't mean to, call him out on things where I do agree with him, because there are several areas where I do agree with him on some key issues, such as the double standards of feminism and so forth. And I can get into that at another point. But the fact remains that he is dead wrong about this issue. So there you go. Sorry, MrRepzion, but you got this one wrong. The Old Testament can exist without the New, because it did exist without the New. And for a lot of people in practicing religions like Judaism, it still exists without the New. So there's that. And it can exist in printed form without the New, in the form of printed copies of the Tanakh. As to the New Testament existing without the Old, well, let me see. There are copies of the New Testament There are printed copies, smaller New Testaments. They exist. There's no Old Testament to them. You can find them being passed out by Gideons everywhere. You can find copies in the New Testament anywhere you look. Just the New Testament. For that matter, you can find copies of just one book in the Bible. That's been passed around. Copies of the book of John, for example. So, where do you get this? You got the New Testament being circulated without the Old. You got the Old Testament being circulated without the New. They can exist without each other. It's fact. So, with that said, that's all I had to say. There's one thing I dislike. It's blatant, really dislike. It's blatant historical inaccuracies going unaddressed. And factual inaccuracies going unaddressed. I have to, at some point, say something about them. Because accuracy counts. It matters. Get your facts straight.